From talking about the Great Pyramids, the Crusades, and then the Mongols, today we will skip over a few centuries of history and cover an event that happened just long enough ago for almost all the facts to emerge, the controversy to have subsided, perhaps only slightly, and yet for the event to still be meaningful to us today. It's not that I'm afraid of controversy. I don't want people to think I'm being controversial simply for attention. What you realize very quickly with studying history is that it's always controversial and it's always political. A good example of this would be a few decades ago in 1992, when it was the 500-year anniversary of Columbus's discovery of the New World. And instead of celebrating his achievement, bravery, and skill, academics were doing their best to diminish his accomplishments and sully his reputation, branding him as, what else? An oppressor. We will discuss the Age of Exploration and its immense implications and how it changed the world in a future video. What are we talking about today? The sinking of the RMS Lusitania. How it brought America into World War I, and maybe we can even get to Pearl Harbor and how America was brought into World War II. It's difficult to know where to begin, as I don't know what all of you were taught in school, but for myself, I remember the sinking of the Lusitania being portrayed as extremely important, but at the same time, very little attention was paid to it. There was very little discussion of the details. Now, you may be thinking, what do the details matter? The Germans sunk a civilian passenger ship, one of the largest in the world at the time, resulting in the death of almost 1,200 innocents, passengers and crew altogether. Sounds pretty clear-cut in terms of an act of war, a travesty, and a tragedy, right? You might want to stick around till the end of this video and see if your perspective hasn't changed at all. Now let's get to the basics. Who, what, when. Wait, where's the intro? Roll the footage. Alright, we're back. Who? The Germans and the passengers on the Lusitania, mostly British, but also about 140 American citizens. What? A massive 800-foot long ship, almost 90 feet across, with 9 passenger decks, 25 boilers, capable of carrying up to 2,200 passengers and an additional 850 crew members. Where? The Lusitania was torpedoed about 12 miles off the southern coast of Ireland in a declared war zone. When? May 7th, 1915, about 10 months after the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. It was at the same time that they started a blockade, and even food could not be imported to Germany. Why? This is where things get interesting. Why did the Germans torpedo the Lusitania? It turns out that the Germans suspected the Lusitania of carrying hundreds of tons of war munitions. I don't know about you, but I think they skipped that part in my history class. What? Not only that, but the British government denied at the time that there were munitions on board, which made it appear that the Germans had simply torpedoed a civilian passenger ship, because, you know, they're German. But not only was the Lusitania carrying munitions, in the months prior to the sinking of the Lusitania, the British had introduced Q ships, ships disguised as cargo ships or fishing trawlers that actually had hidden armaments, large guns on board. In addition, the rules of engagement at the time said that a U-boat was not supposed to attack an unarmed vessel without warning. This meant that the U-boat had to surface and demand surrender, not open fire with torpedoes while still hidden and underwater. The use of Q ships was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Even the Lusitania, it appears, was given orders to ram any U-boats that surfaced, as opposed to surrender to them. It also had gun mounts, although allegedly there weren't any guns installed at the time that it was sunk. It would appear that the British used civilians as a human shield, the sort of thing ISIS gets accused of these days. There's still a bit more to cover. You're going to want to hear this. But first, a word from our sponsors. Based on the true history of the early days of gunpowder weapons, my first work of fiction, Conquest of Truth. In 1302 AD, following the mysterious death of his father, the Duke of Styria, and grandfather, Rudolph, King of the Romans, Johann, just 12 years old, is forced to flee the Holy Roman Empire. Entrusted with a terrible secret by loyal Cistercian monks, Johann must solve the murder, become a man, and plot the destruction of his enemies. Check it out. The reason I'm not doing more videos about 14th century European history right now is because if you want to know more about it, you should read my book. Alright, where were we? Yes, the Lusitania and the impact its sinking had. Now, keep in mind, Canada was a legal dominion of Britain, so it was automatically a part of World War I when war was declared. By the British, I remind you. But not America. America didn't enter the war for 2 years after the sinking of the Lusitania. Even still, it was one of the major reasons for his entrance. Woodrow Wilson and Congress decided that because the Imperial German government has committed repeated acts of war against the people of the United States of America, the US had been thrust into war. The Lusitania sunk on May 7th, but the next day, May 8th, a German spokesman, Dr. Bernhard Dernberg, published a statement saying the ship contained contraband of war. On board at the time were 4 million rifle carriages and 50 tons of artillery shells. The assistant manager of the Cunard line denied that the ship carried munitions, but the Germans said that the ship had on previous trips carried munitions and troops. America's Secretary of State, W.J. Bryan, resigned because he felt Woodrow Wilson was being biased in favor of Britain, even though they were ignoring international law and thus leading America into war. People in America were even told that German school children had celebrated the sinking and been given a holiday. There are just 2 more points I want to get to. Firstly, the British government only admitted in 1982, 67 years after the fact, that there really were munitions on board. After being adamant for decades that there weren't, they admitted it. Not a year or 2 after, not when the war ended, not even 50 years afterwards. They waited until everyone who was alive at the time, or who was an adult at the time, was dead. And even then, I get the feeling that in 1982, it was page 6 news, not headline news. Something that I learned today was it seems that in World War II, the British even bombed the wreckage of the Lusitania. with depth charges. I guess that was because they wanted to see if they could blow up the unexploded munitions that were in the wreck. And the last thing you didn't know about the sinking of the Lusitania? The German embassy in Washington, D.C. had placed a newspaper advertisement warning passengers that ships going through the war zone were at risk of being sunk. This was at least 2 weeks before the Lusitania was torpedoed. As for Pearl Harbor, that looks like we'll have to wait for another video. See you again during the next episode of Critical History. If you enjoyed this video, if you learned something, smash that like button, hit the subscribe, tune in next time, and of course, stay critical.